Wright is back with us again. Mark, John, all that good stuff, right? All right. May the force be with you. Your kids still into Star Wars, right?
Yeah.
Okay, where's my phone?
Well, good morning again, all. I see many familiar faces from last week and maybe some new faces, so welcome back to those of y'all that are returning. My name is Wright. I'm on the faculty at Baptist Theological Seminary at Richmond, BTSR here in town, and I'm a graduate of Union Presbyterian Seminary, so I do have some Presbyterian roots and connections. And I'm a member at Tabernacle Baptist Church here in town. But was so thrilled to be welcomed by you guys last week, and I'm grateful for the hospitality that I've received. So I wanted to tell you briefly, since we've been talking about Rome, the Roman Empire. My friend Amanda, she teaches at Belmont University. She wrote her dissertation on the Gospel of Luke. Ended up having a child, a boy, named him Lucas, which is the Greek name for Luke. And I have two boys now. The first one is named Julian, named after Julius Caesar. Not directly, but we like the name. And my second son, we have a 1-year-old who's actually here this morning in the nursery. His name is Adrian, which is a variant of Hadrian, who built the wall. So I have two children named after Roman emperors.
We expect great things.
Well, they weren't the nicest people, so yeah, we're gonna hope for better for my children. But anyway, thank you for welcoming me. Thank you for welcoming Adrian this morning. We are talking about the Roman Empire and reading John's Gospel within the context of the Roman Imperial world. I want to sort of very briefly recap what we covered last week. We were talking about Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and we sort of said it was this sort of like political demonstration, this military parade, if you will, or at least sort of mimicking a Roman military parade, and so there was certain power dynamics. Jesus is on a donkey, enacting this hidden transcript of resistance against Roman rule and domination. Jesus, in contrast to Rome and its emperor, is this king of humility and peace, one who does away with the weapons of war and violence. So that's sort of what we talked about last week. Yeah, I left sort of thinking, what does it mean for us as Christians to follow this sort of figure, this king on a donkey, not Caesar? What does it mean to follow Jesus, not Caesar? And I think, among many other things, it means that we're called to be peacemakers. We're called to be people who bring about God's reign of peace. I don't have any sense that I can be prescriptive for you all as a congregation or for you all as individuals about what it means to be peacemakers. But I think that what we were wrestling with is that part of what it means to be a Christian is that you have to be involved in peacemaking in some way. And so maybe we'll even talk a little bit about that as we get into today's text. I did have one follow-up. There's a question last week that I didn't know the answer to. Someone asked about the word colt came up in the reading. They said, I often think that a colt is a horse. I did look, young donkeys can also be called colts. So I just wanted to follow up on that. I'm no zoologist, I had to Google quite a bit. But it's interesting, in Mark, Jesus promises to return the donkey. Roman soldiers would often requisition property, so they would have just taken the donkey and they could have kept it. And Jesus sort of, even in that small gesture, contrasts with the Roman power and the Roman military. So anyway, just to kind of follow up on last week. Here's our trajectory. So last week we did the Palm Sunday text. This week we're going to be reading Jesus' arrest in John. We're going to take a quick detour to Mark to see sort of the typical take on Jesus' arrest, and then we'll read John because John does a pretty unique thing with Jesus' arrest. Next week we'll talk about Jesus' trial before Pilate. You'll have to come back next week to see why I put that in quotation marks. And then the week after that we'll deal with the crucifixion. And so these are all scenes in which Jesus comes most directly into conflict with Roman imperial power. What I don't want to do is give the impression that these are the only places where Rome is present in the Gospel of John. And so I want to give you a quick example. Even when Rome doesn't seem like they're still there. So for example, in the last chapter of the Gospel of John, Jesus is resurrected and Peter goes fishing of all things, right? This is what he does. And John says he goes fishing on the Sea of Tiberias, which is another name for the Sea of Galilee, but named for Emperor Tiberius, all right? So if you conquer a place, you can name things whatever you want. So John explicitly locates this fishing scene in its Roman imperial context. So Peter goes fishing in the emperor's waters, so to speak. And in Roman imperial ideology, the emperor controlled the waters, was responsible for this great abundance of the land. So the harvests were good, the seas were full of fish. And how many fish does Peter catch that night? Anybody remember?
No.
0. Yeah, so it's this subtle sort of commentary, implicit commentary perhaps on the abundance that the emperor's reign provides. A lot of people live at subsistence level in the Roman Empire, a lot of people, and a lot of people are falling below subsistence level. Then Jesus comes along, he says, actually cast your net on the other side of the boat, and then they haul in 153 fish. And so there's this contrast between the abundance that the Roman emperor claims in Roman propaganda, and then this abundance that Jesus provides. So even when Rome's not there, they're still there, if that makes sense. They're the empire, all right? Just a simple example. So that's where we're headed. Sort of a quick entry point into our discussion of the text today. I want to talk about the socio-economic makeup of the Roman Empire. And this is always kind of a fun topic. For me, this is sort of a map of what the socio-economic world of the first century Roman Empire looks like. It's done by a scholar named Gerhard Lenski from a book called Power and Privilege. You can see, you might actually not be able to see, but on the left side we have power and privilege. So the higher we go on this chart, the more powerful and more wealthy someone is, or people are. And then the lateral is quantity. So let me try to help us break down this just a little bit. You can see all the way at the very top, I can barely reach it, is this little pinprick. This is one person, this is the ruler. And they may possess as much as 50% of the empire's wealth. So who is that? The Roman emperor, yes, yep. So, and then much farther down actually is the governing class. You can kind of see this slice, all right? So some members of the governing class are going to be very, very powerful and very, very wealthy. Some members of the governing class are going to be less powerful and less wealthy, but still elite members of society. This would be people like governors, like Governor Pilate, members of the Herodian dynasty, King Herod, and so forth. Then we have beneath them retainers and priests. And so this would be, for example, military personnel, generals. I'm going to look at my notes just to make sure I don't forget anything. Bureaucrats, scribes, priests, centurions, Sadducees, members of the Jewish Sanhedrin. So folks that are also going to have a significant amount of wealth and power, all right? Down here we have peasants, all right? They're the folks that are actually doing agricultural work, right? This is an agrarian aristocratic empire, so wealth is produced by the peasants actually. They're the ones that are doing the backbreaking work and harvesting crops, catching fish and so forth, and they're taxed as much as 66% by the elite. Yeah, so wealth flows upward. It's created down here and it flows upward on the chart. These people are living at subsistence level on good days and occasionally falling below subsistence level. So they're sort of, yeah, living hand to mouth, experiencing periods of hunger, all right?
Were they taxed in monetarily taxed, or were they taxed in form of the products they produced on their
Yes.
farm?
Yeah. Sometimes taxed in the form of forced labor. A lot of these peasants, the reality of being a peasant is that you more than likely don't own your own land. A member of the elite class does. So one of these members of the governing class or a retainer or a priest, and you actually rent the land that you work on. And so you're kind of at the mercy of the elite members of society. There's not really a middle class in the first century Roman Empire.
Were there slaves?
I'm sorry?
Were there slaves? Were people owned slaves?
So the interesting thing about slavery in the Roman Empire is you could find slaves most anywhere on here. If you were the emperor's slave, you were living pretty good. You had a nice room and fancy clothes and great food, and you probably oversaw a staff. If you were a slave down here, you had a pretty miserable lifestyle.
But they did it, people did own slaves.
Absolutely, yeah.
Who wrote the book of John? I mean, maybe a dumb question, but who wrote it?
That's a great question. Can I come back to that in just a little bit? Yeah. Actually, I heard that question right beforehand, but yes, sir.
Well, who produced the W-2s for all these? And is the taxing a negotiation?
It is tax day today, isn't it?
Is it a negotiation process? How do they know? And
Yeah. Well, there's certainly a strong power dynamic, and I, to be honest, haven't studied at great length taxation in the Roman Empire, so I don't know all the details. My hunch is that there wasn't as much paperwork involved then as it is now.
Ask Matthew.
I'm sorry?
Ask Matthew.
Ask Matthew, that's
Well,
right.
with the hatred for the tax collectors, one would assume some of that
Yes.
came from disproportionate taxation.
That's right, yeah, and it's not always fair. Not that taxes today are always fair either. But the tax collectors are going to be somewhere probably on this continuum. So a retainer, they sort of work in the service of the elite, the upper echelons of power. Artisans are folks that produce like crafts, you know, things that aren't agricultural production. So Jesus, as a carpenter, might fall into this category. Merchants are folks that sell to the elite, so they tend to be wealthier. The unclean and degraded are folks that are necessary for society, but their work, for whatever reason, renders them unclean in society's eyes. So minors, prostitutes would be considered unclean and degraded. They're sort of necessary for society's function, but looked down upon pretty severely. They're at the bottom of society. And then expendables are really folks that aren't necessary for society's functioning at all. If you're an expendable person and you die, no one notices. So this would be like people who are crippled in the first century. Blind Bartimaeus would be an example of this. Begging, bandits. You know, if one of these people dies, Lazarus from the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, when he dies, no one buries him, right? There's no significant loss to society. So that's sort of the expendable class. That's a quick sort of snapshot of what the socio-economic world of the first century Roman Empire looks like. So let me just ask a couple questions.
Excuse me,
Oh, yeah.
if someone died and they don't bury them, where are their bodies? I mean, that's kind of gross.
Yeah, it depends. You know, Lazarus, I could imagine being sort of hauled off to like a mass grave or something on the edge of town.
Okay.
Some could have been consumed by animals. Crucifixion victims were often consumed by animals, which is why it's a big deal that Jesus is buried. They would leave them on the cross and they would just get picked apart, or they would, you know, take them down and throw them in the woods, and then they'd, you know.
Decompose.
Decompose is a generous way to put it, yeah. Yeah, good question. Gory, but yeah, good. I don't know, maybe it's a thoughtful question. Yeah, well, I hope that sort of helps us locate where we are. So we're talking about Jesus' arrest today. When the arresting party arrives on the scene, we're talking about representatives from the elite classes, all right? So Pontius Pilate, Roman governor, is gonna be, you know, I'm gonna put him probably up here somewhere. The Jewish high priest is probably gonna be right here. And the reality in the Roman Empire is that there's no such thing as separation between church and state. That's a pretty modern invention. And so if you're the high priest, if you're a member of the priesthood in Jerusalem, you're a political person too. And so they actually collaborate with Roman authorities to maintain the status quo, all right? And then Jesus is gonna be down here. So there's a big power differential, a big socio-economic differential, all right? We may have a few other things to say about that in a little bit. But I want to read some text. So let's open up to Mark 14, verses 43 to 51. And so we're just going to read this and look at this briefly before we jump over to John to see how John is unique. All right. So anybody want to read that? This is probably going to be a pretty familiar arrest of Jesus for you as you hear this. Anybody got that?
I got it.
Yeah, thank you.
Immediately, while he was still speaking. Am I on the right one?
Yep, you got it.
Immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. And with him there was a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." So when he came, he went up to him at once and said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. Then they laid hands on him and arrested him. But one of those who stood near drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to them, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a bandit? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled." All of them deserted him and fled. A certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They caught hold of him.
Oh, one more verse. But he,
Oh,
we read
but
it
he
one more time.
left the linen cloth and ran off naked.
Yeah, thanks. I deliberated about whether or not to include that verse.
You did it, that's why.
A curious detail. So, well, let me just ask, what stands out to you from this text, or what seems familiar, or anything that you don't remember reading that sort of pops off the page to you?
I thought Jesus reprimanded Peter for cutting the soldier's ear off.
Yeah, two things. There's no reprimand. The ear gets cut off, and it apparently stays cut off, and there's no reprimand. And it also doesn't say that it's Peter.
No.
It just says one of those who stood near. So hold on to that thought until we bump over to John, and John will fill us in on that detail. Yeah, good thought. Anything else that sort of stands out to you? Yes, sir.
I don't recall other places where the kiss is relevant to anything in the New Testament, except here.
Oh, okay.
And in The Godfather, yeah, included. So, can you help me understand why a kiss? Because I don't remember the disciples kissing Jesus at any other time.
Okay. So, and kissing has a little bit of a different feel in the first century culture, in this type of cultural world. Paul, in his writings, often at the end of the letter will say, greet one another with a holy kiss. So this is sort of a culture where you might, kiss someone on the cheeks or something. So it's a sign of affection. It doesn't have to be, like a man and a woman expressing. It's not romantic affection. In fact, the Greek word for kiss, believe it or not, is phileo, which is where we get Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. So it literally means to love, but also can have that sort of meaning of kiss. So it very, very literally it says he came up and loved him like a brother, basically. But I assume it's a peck on the cheek. And we'll see we might see some artwork in a little bit. I don't know why he just didn't point. That's the guy, grab him. Except that it expresses a certain amount of intimacy, and I think heightens the betrayal, if that makes sense. And the text certainly underlines that. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, sort of doubles down on this notion that this is one of Jesus' closest people. And then in verse 44, now the betrayer had given them a sign. It almost becomes like a title or name for Judas in early Christian history, the betrayer.
Could it be interpreted as an embrace, or is it truly? Is it commonly interpreted as a kiss?
Most commonly as a kiss. I don't know. I could imagine that it also involved an embrace. Yeah. Yes.
The Arab men today do that with each other.
That's right.
I've seen it in newsreels or something.
Yeah, Middle Eastern cultures, and a lot of different cultures around the world, the kiss is still a sign of friendship, affection, not necessarily romantic affection. Yeah, so, yes, sir.
There's a quote I remember, but from where I don't recall, which is, the truth ends after the event occurs. Essentially, question what you're now being told happened unless someone was there. So, I'm wondering, do we need to question in interpreting this whether, in fact, the report of the kiss taking place by Judas was something that one of the apostles came up with as, this is a way to get the message across as opposed to what really happened?
Sort of to convey the meaning of the act. I think that's a great question. I don't have, 2,000 years after the fact, we can't be sure what really happened. But I think the point you're making is that this says something about the betrayal itself, whether or not the kiss historically happened. It certainly says something about the relationship, and maybe the gospel seem to suggest that Jesus knew this was going to happen, and that it was, it at least is a strong insinuation that he knew Judas was up to this, and that he would still let Judas get that close to him. Maybe says something profound about Jesus too. So, yes, ma'am.
It's interesting that the Roman soldiers obviously don't know Jesus.
Well, and there's no Roman soldiers here,
Or
but
whoever came to arrest
yes.
him didn't know him.
Yes, that's right. So that evidently has to be identified to these.
So he couldn't have been, he wasn't very notorious that whoever was arresting didn't know.
So he's only been in Jerusalem for less than a week at this point in the Gospel of Mark, and this is the first time he's been to Jerusalem in Mark. So he has spoken in the temple, but these folks that the Jewish elite send to arrest him evidently don't know him by face, so he has to be identified. Yeah, great.
It always seemed to me that he kissed him because he didn't want perhaps to be so obviously saying he's the one.
Okay.
That, you know, he had said, I will kiss him, and then you can know that he's the one to arrest. Because maybe even though he knew, Jesus knew,
Yeah.
that he was gonna betray him, maybe the other disciples didn't know it at that point.
So maybe it's not an overt betrayal, like he's the
Right,
guy,
yeah.
grab him,
That's
but
what
sort of
I always
yeah, I think that could certainly be the case too. So, well,
It's a
let's.
much better story to be betrayed by a kiss than just be pointed out.
Well, and if we have time, I'll show you some artwork, and it will be in almost every piece of art of this scene is this attempt at a kiss. So it's a very compelling sort of image. Yep. Let's flip over to John 18 because John is gonna do John's own thing, and it's gonna get interesting, I think. So Matthew and Luke are gonna follow Mark's account pretty closely. So you could go home after today and read Matthew and Luke, and it's gonna sound pretty similar to Mark. John is gonna have some very significant details that are different. So someone wanna read John 18, 1 through 12?
I got it.
Sure, thanks.
After Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas brought a detachment of soldiers together with police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that was to happen to him, came forward and asked them, "Whom were you looking for?" They answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus replied, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with him. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they stepped back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Whom are you looking for?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you are looking for me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. "I did not lose a single one of those whom you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back into that sheath. And am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" So the soldiers, their officer, and the Jewish police arrested Jesus and bound him. First they took him to...
Oh, that's good. That's perfect. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, and I think your inflection was right on. I think there might, we might interpret some humor in this scene, especially when the group falls down. Sort of a moment of schadenfreude, sort of delight at the suffering of others. So something very big in this scene that wasn't in the last scene is this detachment of soldiers, right? We didn't have explicit soldiers mentioned in Mark or Matthew or Luke. So I want to unpack this a little bit. The Greek word is sphaira, and that is usually translated from Latin as a cohort. So you've probably heard of a legion. A Roman legion is about 5,000 soldiers. What are you imagining here? You know, Judas, some folks from the Jewish elite show up in this cohort of evidently Roman soldiers. Anybody want to guess what a cohort is?
In numbers?
Yeah.
20. Yeah.
20 sounds reasonable. Yeah. Anybody else?
15.
15? Okay. Well, this should be fun. 600.
Are you kidding? What?
600 soldiers came.
Totally changes your reading of the scene all of a sudden, right? That's a great response.
I knew the answer, I was just...
That's
playing.
right, you were just... Yeah.
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah.
Great man.
Quite a leader.
Now, this is totally different than what just happened in Mark, because Mark doesn't have this sort of overwhelming military force, and some scholars have have pushed back and said, well, this is totally ridiculous. It was probably 10 or 15. But then you get to the end, to the verse 12. So the soldiers, their officer, the Greek word there is kiliarchos, which is a commander of 1,000. So someone that would be expected to lead troops in this quantity. So I really think when John says 600, I think John has in mind 600. This is sort of in keeping with John's flair for hyperbole. So wedding at Cana, Jesus produces this amazing amount of wine, something like 75 bottles of wine for the wedding. And then the huge catch of fish that I mentioned, 153 fish that Peter hauls in. When Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea go to bury Jesus, they bury him with 75 pounds of spices. So like, keeping his body. So John has sort of this thing for hyperbole. So I think this is what we're looking at is 600 troops literally standing shoulder to shoulder in the garden with their, weapons, ready to arrest this guy. It's not a big garden. Yeah.
It's not a big garden, and one would think, wow, he must be very powerful if it's going to take 600 hombres to wrestle him down. So could that just be hyperbole and little local, color?
Yes. So we're sort of wrestling with history versus, sort of the theological world of the evangelist. What is John trying to say through this? And one of the things is that Rome seems to feel threatened by Jesus, right? If you're going to send a cohort of soldiers, this is probably all of the soldiers that are in Jerusalem for the festival.
Oh, really?
This is about how many Pilate would have on hand. They all show up to arrest this guy. So it seems to suggest, just like you said, that Rome feels threatened by this guy. What else might it say? Thinking about sort of the rhetorical emphasis of saying that there's 600 Roman soldiers. Any thoughts about what sort of impression does it give you?
Well, the show of power.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're making a statement. Power and violence. Remember, we own this territory, and we have troops that are willing to maintain control of that. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah,
I have a
in the back.
question.
Oh, go ahead.
So is, sorry.
Yeah, we'll do one too.
Well, I'm looking at verse 7, I believe, or 6. I am he, Judas, who betrayed him, was standing. I am he, Jesus said. And they stepped back and fell. Who is they?
Hey, that's a good question.
600 soldiers?
I think we are given to imagine that, yes, the entire cohort, all of the Jewish temple police, and Judas all fall to the ground at this declaration by Jesus. So I really do think it's sort of this humorous moment. Here's the world's leading military, the world's superpower, and Jesus overpowers them at his self-identification. And so I can imagine if you're a Christian feeling a bit marginalized in the late 1st century reading this, you're like, wow, I'm glad that I follow this guy, or maybe I should follow this guy, or whatever. But evidently Jesus and God are more powerful than Rome's military might.
So, question, the other 3 Gospels don't specify a cohort, they say a crowd.
Right.
It doesn't define the number of people. Could they have used another Greek word for the commander of a smaller group than a cohort?
So the other 3 Gospels don't mention Roman soldiers at all. They specify sort of a crowd sent by the chief priests, the Jewish elite, the Jewish authorities. So John is the only one where we're going to get a Roman contingent showing up. And a crowd is, y'all are a crowd, or just this section could be a crowd too. Yes, ma'am.
Do you suppose they were afraid of Jesus, had heard of his powers, and thought they might be.
What do you think? And
Well,
they seem to feel threatened, right?
perhaps they were instructed, that this is a powerful man, he does miracles.
Yeah. So yes and yes.
Well, he says, I am he, I am as God. That's how God identifies himself in the
So we
Old
need to talk
Testament.
about that, right? What's missing? I'm gonna follow this line of thinking. What's missing from this scene?
Kiss.
There's no kiss. They're looking for Jesus. Judas doesn't identify him. Jesus steps forward proactively and says, I'm the guy you want. Jesus is in full control of what's going on. He's not a passive participant in this process. He's actually in this gospel directing the events. And he says, ego, a me, literally I am. And this is God's sacred name in the Old Testament. So he says, I am, they all fall down. So this is sort of a display of divine power. We can also maybe imagine, it says they fell to the ground. What do you do when you come into the presence of a divine being? You fall to the ground. So it could sort of be, the gospel writers playing with this a little bit, this sort of like image of Roman soldiers worshiping Israel's God. So I saw another hand. Yes.
Recently viewed Jesus Christ Superstar, and what comes across there, they were not afraid of Jesus, they were afraid of his followers.
Oh, okay.
The high priest and Pontius Pilate himself
Yeah.
wanted to pick up Jesus at a point where he was
Not surrounded by a large
immediate.
following.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah, and that's not a bad interpretation. So thinking about this scene, following up to what you said, Pilate, Roman governor, most powerful representative of Rome and the province of Judea, and Jewish authorities are working in collaboration. This is a good illustration of how politics and religion are not separate, but they're working together to maintain the status quo. It also seems to suggest that Pilate already knows about this, right? When Jesus gets to Pilate for the first time later in this chapter, he probably knows what's going on, because who do you think sent the Roman soldiers? Probably Pilate, right? Especially if they're going to clear out the gatehouse to send these guys. Yes, ma'am.
Is
These are
this
great.
the only telling of this story where the slave's name is used? And why would he have been so, concerned? Why wouldn't he name the priest instead of the slave?
It's going to name the high priest in a few verses, in a few paragraphs, I think. Or maybe, yeah. But yes, it's the only one where the slave is named Malchus. Any idea why they might name him?
What does it mean?
I don't know.
Oh, I thought maybe that was one.
And I also don't know why they name it. I have no clue.
Because didn't Jesus heal his ear in one of the Gospels?
I think so, but not here.
But not
Yes.
this one.
And I don't remember which one he heals it in. But it also names this. It says this is Peter doing the cutting, right?
Yeah.
And Jesus rebukes Peter, which Jesus is apt to do.
I think this is the writer's sort of little way of saying, this is true, I know the
I think
name
so
of
too.
this
Validating.
It's a
person.
very vivid sort of historical detail that's like, yeah, no, that's a great point, and I think that could be. It could also be that Malchus is someone that's that's known to the people that are writing and reading this gospel. Who knows, but absolutely.
Again, to make it true.
Yes, yeah. I see so many questions. Let me time out and just see what I want to make sure that we cover. Can I make a couple more points and then can you pause those, hang on to those questions? Y'all are amazing. Just a few sort of more details that are significant. They come with lanterns and torches, right? Light is a universal symbol since the dawn of time. Light symbolizes, what are some things that light symbolizes? Truth, knowledge, the light bulb goes off, goodness, and so forth. So it's sort of, it doubles down on this. They come bearing lanterns and torches. What it doesn't say is that they come bearing lanterns and torches to arrest the light of the world. So there's a little bit of irony there that they don't know who it is that they're coming to arrest, right? They don't know Jesus' true identity. So they're, we might say they're in the dark, even though they have these light-bearing instruments.
Would that just be because it's dark outside and you'll be able to see further away?
It is. It's a historical detail, and absolutely, I think there's a very practical use for having these. But if we're sort of looking at the symbolism, reading the symbolism under that fact, it might give the suggestion that a little bit more is going on. Nicodemus comes under the cover of darkness when he comes to see Jesus, and then the Samaritan woman comes to Jesus in chapter 4 at high noon, so when the sun's its brightest. So there's a lot of light symbolism, light and darkness symbolism in the Gospel of John. Actually, the first chapter, I'm going to misquote it. The light has come into the world and the darkness has not overcome it, or something. Yes, sir?
I see John not as a technical historian, but as a man, a motivational man who wants to motivate his readers.
He's a poet, yes. Yeah, he's painting pictures. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of theology. We can say it's as historical as we want to, but there's a lot of theology underneath too. Yes, sir?
I still want to know who wrote the book, and
Oh.
it's the same guy who wrote the Revelation of St. John.
Oh, great question. It's probably not. They have a different writing style. Their Greek language is different. And so we talked about this very briefly. This is the 30-second elevator pitch. Probably not the actual Apostle John, but maybe folks who knew him. It seems to have some sense that there's a basis for the gospel on historical testimony of someone who knew Jesus. All right, so late 90s, whoever knew Jesus is pretty old, if not dead already. But maybe the people that put pen to paper knew someone who knew Jesus. Okay? All right, yes, ma'am.
If it wasn't John the Apostle, why then in verse 15 does he say, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple? Because I think there occurs more than once in the book where he refers to another disciple, and it seems like it's so obviously himself.
So this is a great question, and we could spend, books have been written about this.
Okay.
I was going to say we could spend an hour, we could spend decades.
Yeah.
But the beloved disciple, there's this figure, doesn't show up until after John chapter 11 or 12. Chapter 12 is the first time we hear of this. This disciple that Jesus loved is leaning on him at the Last Supper. It's ambiguous who this figure is. It could be, some have suggested, the Apostle John. It could be, some have suggested Lazarus, because he doesn't show up until Lazarus is resurrected. Some have suggested that it's actually a female, and so it's covering up the gender of this disciple because, you know, women are sort of lesser in the first century. And some folks think it's actually a projection of the reader, so that you're supposed to see yourself in the beloved disciples' shoes when you're reading the text.
What about the letters?
Oh, yeah.
What about the letters of John? Are they, is that a third?
Yeah, we're gonna have to stretch this series.
Stay a little bit longer, you can come
Yeah.
in June.
Is that still a third type, or?
First, second, and third John are probably written by a third individual, but in the same community that produced the Gospel of John. They use such similar language. The light and dark imagery is really pronounced. Yeah, so I would say same community as the Gospel of John, maybe not the same author as the Gospel of John. The author of the epistles, the letters of John, identifies as the elder, but unnamed. So
By the way, Luke is where the ear is healed.
Luke,
The gospel.
Jesus heals the ear in Luke.
In
Thank
Luke,
you.
yes.
Can you come back in 10 years and see, tell us if the opinions have changed?
My calendar's wide open. Let me just point out a couple other things that I think are really interesting. So Jesus says, "I am He." They all fall to the ground. The gospel never says they get back up. I think we have to imagine that they do, but they're evidently laying on the ground until the end of the scene. Sort of a funny little
Is it
detail.
the people who came to arrest him that fell?
Yes.
Or, okay.
The arresting party. Yes. So imagine you're the arresting party. I'm Jesus. You come into the garden. I am self-confident. I step forward and say, "I am He." You all fall down. And then Jesus says again, "Who are you Oh, they say Jesus of Nazareth. Oh, it says, "Who are you looking for?" Again, so a second time, and then again he says, "I am He." So he's like, I just want to make it abundantly clear, I'm the guy you're looking for. And so he's sort of acting in full control of events. There's no doubt about who's in charge here. It's not the people, it's not the commander of the cohort, it's Jesus, all right? And one other detail, the "who are you looking for" is sort of a theological question in the gospel. So it's so it shows up at the very beginning of the gospel. Jesus asks, "What are you looking for?" to his first disciples. What are you looking for? He doesn't really mean like, what literally are you looking for? He means sort of like, what are you looking for? And then at the very end, Jesus in chapter 20, Mary Magdalene shows up and she says, "Who are you looking for?" And she thinks he's the gardener. So it's sort of deep theological question. Jesus asks, "Who are you guys looking for?" And they miss it. If it's sort of like an invitation to discipleship. It's like, y'all can follow me, and they totally miss it.
Sort of like seeking could be used.
That's actually the Greek word, yes. Who are you seeking? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's got strong symbolic theological meaning. So
In Matthew, it says that Jesus says, "Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and He will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?"
12
Perhaps
legions.
they were afraid.
12 legions is a Roman term, yeah, and Jesus is sort of
Threatening.
a different type of
angels.
power,
Yeah.
military power, but also power, yeah. So good, yeah. Well, big picture, what do we do with this? We've just read this text, sort of trying to rediscover the Roman-ness of it, which I think we typically miss when we've read this scene in the past. What do we do with this? What is the gospel writer trying to do? What's our takeaway? What can you think of some sort of like big picture? Like when we walk out of the room, what are we thinking? We'll remember some fun details, but what's the big picture too? Any thoughts on that?
It seems exculpatory of Judas, that Judas is not a factor.
Absolutely, it's not going to let Judas off the hook. Yeah, yeah.
I think the big takeaway is this was written close to 100 years after Christ, and there was a movement happening. I think he's trying to, and Rome's still in power. Not much has changed. I think he's trying to say to this movement, this happened, it was important, it was big. You got to realize that Christ had power, however you want to interpret it, whether the power of extra human or the power of just people and a movement of things that's the truth that's right.
Sure.
And that you need to follow it, you need to keep going. I think that's what John's trying to say, opposed to details of he has no idea what happened. You know, it's so, how could we write something that happened 100 years ago? But he has the understanding that this is important, it must continue, and if you need these symbols of power, here they are.
And, yeah, and power is a good word here, right? So Rome shows up with this display of power. Rome rules and maintains rule of its empire through threat of violent power. And Jesus we've seen as this peaceful king. He says, Peter, put down your sword. So two contrasting types of power, right? Yeah, so great point. Yes, ma'am?
And Jesus, in identifying himself twice, is definitely accepting his fate.
Yes, absolutely. And he will remain in full control, as we see next week and the week after, that he's, you know, full speed ahead to the cross. He doesn't suffer on the cross in the Gospel of John. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Backwards logic I like sometimes is, I think in Mark the cock crows, and I think in John it crows twice.
Maybe 3 times.
And who among us is going to argue about those details?
Yeah.
That we certainly don't need to go there.
Mm-hmm.
And the message may not be which ear was cut off.
Oh, sure, right.
The message, I think we're supposed to be looking for something else.
Some readers get caught up in the details and they're like, oh, well, this is a little bit different than this gospel, but they're speaking theology, right? And I have 1 more minute. Yeah.
Do whatever you want.
Yes.
But 100 years after Jesus, so when this gospel was written, what was happening just with Christians in the Roman Empire? Were they being persecuted? Were they just kind of seen as another sect running around?
A minority sect in corners, pockets of the Roman Empire. I mean, so 90, yes, sort of in the middle of a painful separation from Judaism. They're still sort of conflated as one religion, but as Christianity becomes separate from that, Judaism sort of has a decent reputation in the Roman Empire, and Christianity is like, what is this new religious thing? So they weren't necessarily violently persecuted, with the exception of in the 60s by Emperor Nero, and then much later, like centuries later, there was this sort of violent persecution that we tend to think about, like being thrown to lions, but probably a fair amount of distrust and sort of social awkwardness and marginalization. So we're, you know, we're sort of, you know, in the power center as Christians in the 21st century in America. We're slowly diminishing, but it would feel very different in the first century as a Christian. Yes, sir? Oh, okay. Man, I think we could go for a while, but I think I should turn you all loose. But I'm happy to stick around for 15 minutes if you want to come up and chat and follow up. And I'll be back next week and then the week after. So we'll continue some.
Thank you. I just want to make sure.